We're back.
All right, let's get into
You're
it.
just like your face when I start singing.
You have a great voice.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I think you could be in a opera or an indie band.
Yeah, I feel like I have indie girl bangs right now. I got my bangs cut and I look like Feist circa 2009.
I was wondering what was going on there. You did
Yeah,
get
it's a
your
lot of
bangs
forehead.
cut.
It's a lot of forehead right now. But that's okay.
It
I
grows
always
back
like
fast.
so we're building towards this race in Italy, the Chianti 120 whatever K.
Yeah. Taper time.
It's taper time, and part of my process is getting a haircut because I have a ton of hair, and when I was doing my long run this weekend, my bangs were getting all in my eyes, and I was like, that's it. And like as soon as I finished, like literally in the trailhead parking lot, I scheduled a haircut. I got the back of my head shaved a little bit, got some hair taken off, and got some bangs taken off. So I'm lighter and more aerodynamic.
Have you ever gotten ice bangs? Do your bangs freeze? Because they're...
So the sides of them do, and sometimes like when I breathe, like the condensation will kind of stick to them, and yeah.
Just curious. Does it create more of a barfy sensation when you're running downhill in cold temps?
Not that I've noticed. I did notice whenever I saw pictures of myself during the Leadville 100 that my bangs were just wet the entire day. So, I mean...
Evaporative cooling.
I committed to this haircut in 2012, and I did not think I would be running 100 milers or running at all at that time, so...
Well, you're rocking it 13 years later.
13 years later, because...
Congrats.
I have the endurance to run 100 miles, but not to grow out bangs. I have a limit.
So what are we getting into today?
We're going to do some hot or nots. It's back. Thank you to everyone who sent those in. And if you have additional hot or nots you want us to rank, send them to microcosmcoaching@gmail.com.
Yeah.
We're going to answer an athlete question about TSS. Then we are going to talk about science and what it means to be evidence-based. And this is actually inspired by one of our YouTube viewers who was asking, like, how do we assess the quality of the studies that we cite on our podcast? And I was like, actually, that is such a good question. Let's talk about, like, how to know if a study is worth talking about and, like, what it actually means to be evidence-based and when science should and shouldn't inform practice. So thank you to YouTube commenter. I actually think that's an incredible thing to talk through, and I can't wait to do that.
Now for the opposite approach, let's give our color commentary on 4 random topics.
Before you get to hear any science, stay tuned for some quasi-informed hot takes.
Okay, hot or not, number 1, hybrid athletes. This is a absolutely hilarious hot or not.
Yeah.
To me.
So it sort of is like it's redundant, it's like a small shrimp.
Small shrimp.
Like all athletes are hybrid.
Technically, maybe.
Like you should be. Like if you're if you're being an athlete, like I always want I call them my athletes. I don't call them my runners. Like my athletes, like most of whom are doing strength training. We build strength training into their running training. Like at minimum, and then many of them are doing other badass athletic things like skiing, biking, hiking, walking, ellipticaling, dog agility. Like we have people who are engaged in multiple physical pursuits, and I mean, again, like if you're a runner who is only ever trying to run and you don't do other athletic things, your career might be pretty short. So I don't know why this term has suddenly become popular, because I feel like I know what it is.
No, it groups a certain kind of man.
Yes.
I guess
High rocks athletes, right? It's the people who do the gym,
and,
like the thing with the ropes and like they're wearing the tight shorts, and I'm happy for them. I can't do push-ups and it seems like they can, so I'm sure that's really great, but I don't think this is a helpful label or hashtag, because I think everyone should approach their athletics. Like, being an athlete, it's a way of being. It's not just running. And I would never want anyone to, like, distill their identity, athletic or otherwise, down to, like, I am one thing.
Yeah. I don't know. I think hybrid athletes are fine. Like, if you're the kind of athlete that likes to do a bunch of different things, or is, like, I guess the way that I view hybrid athletes is, like, hybrid athletes they go big in the gym and they also run ultras. And
That's
like
awesome.
we feel,
Cool.
and I think sometimes in trail and running culture, that feels contradictory.
Yeah, like the strength first athlete.
Yeah. But you know what? If that's you,
Yeah, you're allowed to like what you like.
Fuck yeah, embrace it
That's awesome.
and do it, because we're here to express who we are.
Yeah, my plea would be for everyone who is a hybrid athlete, which again, I think is all of us. If you're gym first, run second, experiment with building that running volume. And if you're run first and struggle to prioritize the strength, balance. It's a hell of a drug. Like, again, like if you, like, I actually love picking heavy things up. Like, I'm not like a gym rat necessarily. We do have like a little exercise nook in our house, and that's my happy place. I love listening to Ezra Klein and lifting heavy things. That makes me very happy.
It's very contradictory.
And I feel very, he talks about, he's a gym guy. He goes to the gym.
No.
Yeah, he talks about it.
Ezra?
Yeah.
He's more of like a coffee shop on a Sunday kind of.
Well, he's a hybrid athlete too. So coffee and lifting. And yeah, all of that is to say, like, your priorities are your priorities, but my plea is like, I'm a runner first, and the strength supports that. The majority of people I work with are runner first, strength second. I also do coach people who compete in like competitive weightlifting and totally still crush or competitive at ultras, because humans are beautiful. I guess that's all I have to say. That's my take.
Embrace who you are, who you want to be, and what you love to do.
Like
and
the things you like.
You know
no
what?
hashtag required.
Yeah, if someone gives you shit for that, just tell them to fuck off.
Yeah, and congratulations to everyone who can do push-ups.
I'm up to 10.
Oh, yay!
Crushing
On your feet?
What? I do normal push-ups here. I can do a regular push-up.
Yay!
Yeah. All right. All right. Run clubs, hot or not?
I think this is hot. I love community. I love hanging out with people. I am an extrovert and like a very extrovert. And I love going to our like hometown group run. I know that like run clubs and group runs are like slightly different.
Similar.
But similar thing.
What's the difference?
Like run clubs are like associated with they might have multiple meetups throughout the week. It's not just a run or just based on a location. There's like an actual structured organization involved. Got it. So like the Sidious Club in Denver or like the Fleet Feet Club in Boulder, if that still exists. But I think that's great. You know, my only caveat there is like, it is always tough when I'm building structured programming for athletes and then they go do a track workout with their run club that has absolutely nothing to do with the like 50K we're building towards or the marathon we're training for. And again, like, I guess this isn't so much a hot take as, again, a plea for balance of like, I want my athletes to engage in community in a way that helps them come back to the sport like motivated and connected and strong and is in alignment with their values. But we want it to support the training, not detract from it. And that balance is going to look different for every athlete throughout different chapters of their lives. But I would also caution, like, you know, ceding your goals and ceding your precious time and energy to things that aren't in support of that.
Yeah. I'm hot on run clubs in general. I think they're awesome. I love, you know, when people get together and have that community and that mutual support. I think it goes a long way. Like just doing training on your own can only get you so far. When you start to get into those challenging moments, it's really important to have other people who are also going through that can offer you perspective, advice, support, someone to just listen to what you're going through. If you're going through it, if you're going and doing your training alone, I would like take a hard step back and ask yourself, like, are my goals really that hard?
Yeah.
Because if they're that tough, if they're so tough, you probably need help doing them. Like the goals that are really hard, you need help to get to a place where you can accomplish them. So I like run clubs as a way to provide that support for people who are really going for it and who want that community. For me personally, I will likely never join a run club because I'm a training first athlete.
Right.
I will always prioritize my training, and I'm not going to go out of my way to go to a run club if it disrupts my training schedule, because I know, like, if I do the stuff that is prescribed to me by my coach, I'm much more likely to accomplish my goals. Yeah. So that's just my personal take on it.
You can do both.
Yeah, you can, for sure. Yeah, helps to have like a really good
Yeah.
understanding of training methodology and how to structure a week of training.
And an understanding of what your values are. Like, I always ask my athletes what
Yeah.
their values are, because like if a core value for them is community, and I structure their training in a way where they never get to see other people, that's not good training.
Yeah, that could be really tough. I think people will probably become resentful in those
Yeah,
situations.
and they won't reach their athletic potential. So like it's like those core values are so important when it comes to like structuring training. It's not just aerobic based, not just VO2 max. Like, how do we use this training to live out your values? Because that is important.
Yeah, here's another hot or not that I think is really actually values oriented. Eventing races.
What does
hot
that
or not?
mean? I don't
That
know what that
means
means.
eventing is when you go to a race simply to partake in the event. You're not pursuing a specific outcome that you have decided is worthy of going for. You're not pursuing a PR or a podium.
It's not like a strategic part of a build up to another event.
No,
You're just like it's like a YOLO.
Yeah, it's just simple. Eventing is just simply to go to be a part of the event, to do the thing for the sake of doing the thing.
So I'm going to caveat my answer with, for me, because of my core values, that's going to be a hard no, dog.
That's a not hot.
That's a not hot.
It's a not hot
for
from
me
Zoe.
personally. And as a coach, again, like, it's my job not to put my values on other people. However, I am always like really curious when people want to, like, you can just do races are for racing, in my opinion. And I guess like, again, like if you really need to explore eventing in a way to like meet your core values and your run goals, I can definitely see a way that would fit in for some people. But I think that like, it's like, I like having some things that we set aside. Like, no, you gotta fucking care about this thing. Like, there's so many things in life that you don't need to get vulnerable about. Like, choose a thing, commit to it, put your heart out there, get soft and squishy, and like send it. And like, we don't do that all the time because that's not sustainable. But I think that like being clear about like, yeah, I gave this person like a few $100s and they gave me a t-shirt and I'm going to go big. Like, I think that is important. And like, competition is a core value for me. It took me a while, like as a woman, to get comfortable owning that. And I am always like want for athletes of all gender identities to explore like any narrative, cultural or otherwise, they're putting on competition that might prevent them from fully connecting with it.
Yeah, I do think that that's something I see a lot with athletes is like, well, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. I'm just going because I want to be a part of the community, or I'm just going because I like the idea of this thing, so I'm going to go do it. And often behind the scenes, that typically is masking wanting to get vulnerable, wanting to find the messy edge where, maybe you go too hard, you don't make it, you DNF. Or maybe you do have a breakthrough, but you never find out because you're eventing all the time. You never put yourself out there. So I do think in the right circumstances, this can be pretty hot because of those folks out there who are very community oriented, community first values, being part of an event and doing it for the sake of like meeting the people on the trail and having the experience with them, and all of that is great. But I do think that likely should be balanced with other events that are done in pursuit of specific outcomes.
Yeah.
That give you an idea of, hey, am I actually progressing at this thing?
Right. Take the safety off physically and emotionally.
Right. Like, am I giving myself an opportunity to get vulnerable, to go for an outcome and maybe not get it and know what that feels like, or maybe get it and know what that feels like too. We need both.
Yeah.
So I like this in certain circumstances. I'm hot on it for athletes who are very values oriented with community.
Yeah.
But also you have to be really aware of this stuff and when it happens and how it happens. And still, like, if you look at a marathon and you're going to event it, or you're going to event 50K or a 100-miler, maybe you're eventing.
Oh my God! Like, don't event a 100. Like,
people
not
do.
I'm gonna
can
say,
just
like,
walk it in. I have had people,
that
Zoe.
is so tough for your body. Like, even like without the mental side of things, like there are physical demands that distance commands that I think need to be taken seriously.
I have coached athletes for races such as Hard Rock, which is an exceptionally difficult race, who have done all the training and then just decided to walk for 2 days.
Oh my God.
And
I have anxiety hearing this.
You know, that's okay.
Again,
that's
but
their
like,
choice. But it's...
Yes. That is why, as coaches, I am always really clear what my values are. And I'm really curious about what my athletes' values are, so I can make sure that coach creep, where I could incidentally graft my values of competition onto someone for whom that is not a value. So again, like I try to be clear about like, here's where my values are. Here's how I as a person respond to this. Feel free to ignore that, but here's how I approach it in coaching too.
All right, hot or not, the last one, the most controversial of our times.
Oh.
Ankle weights.
Ankle weights.
Hot or not?
Okay, how and why? And also, WTF.
Well, I've gotten a lot of questions from athletes lately because they've seen some videos online of some really great athlete using ankle weights in their warm-up. I checked this out. To be fair, that athlete said, you know, don't do this. This is just something that I do. I don't recommend it to other people, but I've had athletes actually ask me, should I warm up with ankle weights? Should I be using ankle weights during my runs? I am not hot on this.
Yeah.
I just don't think there's any science to support it.
Yeah, there's not a single study. Again, that doesn't mean anything. And N of 1 also doesn't mean anything.
Right.
I feel like this falls into a pretty hacky territory where, like, again, like, I'm just not going to update my practice without sort of, like, meeting a certain threshold of evidence. And I think that the worst way to make decisions about your athletic career is so-and-so did this, therefore I should do it. Because there are a lot of variables between you and literally anyone else, particularly someone who is an elite athlete and like an outlier. Like, those are the people we should be least likely to extrapolate from. So
I think it's funny. Like, I think ankle weights are great to have in your home strength area. You're doing your hip extenders, doing some glute work. But don't wear them running, please. Not hot.
Don't do that. And this sort of falls like into the category of like same with weight vests. Like most of the evidence shows it just makes you really good at being inefficient at running. So
okay, let's move on. Athlete question. Thank you for sending this in. Can you give us your take on TSS?
Ooh.
My Suunto GPS watch provides TSS as one of the training metrics, and it's something I have not really paid attention to before. Is it an effective measure of training load in progress? If so, how should an athlete measure its accumulation? So I'm going to start off by saying I don't know the black box algorithm in which Suunto uses to calculate TSS.
Yeah.
But I am really familiar with running training stress score, or RTSS, in Training Peaks. So I'm going to answer this question from that perspective.
Yeah, and I will throw in the caveat that I feel like I say twice a day, every single day, but like, fuck your watch. If you don't know how these numbers are, like, again, like my Strava told me I was in the worst shape of my life, like the day before I podiumed at Leadville. These things are not that smart. They are trying to be smart. They are not as smart as we are. Your watch is not a fortune teller, and data isn't like, again, all data is imperfect because you are not a robot and you are not a number. So we're squishy, soft human animal things. And that is, I think, an important context to acknowledge here. And even like, you know, some algorithms are better than others, but I find all the ones on watches of like your training, detraining, VO2 max, or like none of those in any way are accurate enough to use for anything. The watch ones.
The watch ones.
I think that Training Peaks, because it has much better access to data, can be better.
So let's just talk for a couple minutes about this, then we'll move on into our conversation around science and studies. What is RTSS? So if you're an athlete out there who's self-coaching, you're using Training Peaks. If you don't have Training Peaks set up to calculate RTSS and yours is set up to calculate TSS, you're automatically not going to get an accurate training stress score.
Because it's based on power. It uses power as part of the equation.
So power, according to Training Peaks, the creators of the app and the people who work on that app, and like TSS is based on power, which comes from biking, but we don't have an accurate assessment of power for runners. So the second most accurate way of understanding stress is using your pace zones and calculating it in terms of the running intensity. So how fast were you running? At what intensity were you running? Versus how long the workout was.
Right.
And using those two factors to determine the stress of a workout. And so this only functions properly if your back end in Training Peaks is set up with an accurate functional threshold pace. So like a 1 hour effort pace. You have to have your zones set up, because the way that the app works is it compares everything to what percentage of your threshold you are running at.
Yeah.
So the closer you are to your threshold pace and the longer you go, the higher the stress. If you exceed your threshold pace, maybe you're doing 5K, 10K work, 3K, 5K work, stress is going to go up. It's going to be higher. Obviously, your forever effort recovery style runs are going to be a very low stress score. So TSS really is just basically understanding like what training stress was this run, what training stress was that run, and getting to understand that yes, this can be an accurate way to understand basically like the impact of one session compared to another. And so Training Peaks then uses that to create a performance management chart, which is also very helpful. So you can see your chronic training load, you can see your acute training load, and you can see your fatigue for a week and things like that. But all of that stuff is only as good as your understanding of your pacing zones related to that threshold effort.
Yeah. So, and you have to constantly update again, like no data is perfect. Doing a field test, a threshold test is important. Is critical for getting more updated data, but it also evolves with time. So I think that that's always an important thing to caveat here, and why, again, having a coach, very useful. You can, of course, do your own field test, but there's, I think, more or less accurate ways of interpreting that and then figuring out what zones you want to use, because they are all different depending on what methodology you want to use. There's some wiggle room around there, and different coaches use different RPE. And again, we're only proxying. Your body doesn't know what zone 5 is. So I think that rather than being overwhelmed by that data and nuance, you can lean into the complexity of like, you know what, like I don't need to be perfect with stuff. I just need to get always better at listening to my body.
Yeah. And I think just from a coaching perspective, and if you're self-coaching, and you're using an app like Training Peaks, you can use those TSS values to just understand how your bot, like what the load is based on specific workouts, and you can compare one session to the other, and then you can adjust your training accordingly. For example, like if you go and do a very long run, 4 hours, that's going to produce a high TSS score. And so you see that score and you can compare that against a run that you do for 60 minutes and you can see the difference. Oh, if I have this high of a score, perhaps I should do something more like 60 minutes the next day in order to get the rest and recovery I need. Obviously, there's a heck of a lot more nuance there but that's just like very broad terms. And you can also, use this to manage that load week to week in order to produce peak fitness at times. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. You want to have progressive overload in your training. So you need to have progressive stress, but you have to have rest too in order to do that. So these are just tools that the app uses to manage these things. You can do it without it. That's a little more vibes based that way, in my opinion. I like to have the data and how the athlete feels both to support an overall view of the training. I wouldn't use TSS on Asunto alone unless there's some way to like really update the zones in there, or
Right.
to know what the black box algorithm is specifically, like what are they using to calculate that score? Because in Training Peaks, all that stuff is available for the
Right. Yeah,
coaches
they
and
show you what the.
users.
I actually used to email the equation to my athletes because it's like normalized power as a percentage of threshold. And my athletes were like, hard pass on this because it looks like the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally in terms of its
Right.
complexity. And you don't need to 100% understand how it's calculated. You need to understand what it means.
Yes,
Stress.
like I do this and my body feels this.
Yeah. Hard, not hard.
I think it's much more important for athletes to have a strong awareness around that before they ever like try to figure out what the numbers are
Yeah.
and mean.
Yep. But yeah, I do think it's a useful data point to have. But again, no single data point is like something everyone should bow down to.
Totally. All right. What does it actually mean to be evidence-based?
So I'm really pumped to talk about this because my graduate degree is in science and environmental journalism. So I am a professional science communicator outside of my job actually a big part of my job as a coach and a big part of my job as a journalist is taking science and translating it as accurately as possible for a general audience of people who do not have graduate degrees in science. And a lot can go wrong in that process. And I think particularly in the world of fitness and running, a lot does go wrong in that process.
Ankle weights.
Ankle weights. And the phrase evidence-based gets thrown around a lot, right? But what is it? Because like we advertise pretty heavily on the concept of being evidence-based. And I think if you don't know what it means, that can just kind of sound like buzzwords, but it
Right.
actually is really important and has a specific definition. And so what having an evidence-based approach means is that you're making decisions based on the best available scientific research combined with expert judgment and real-world application.
So what does that mean specifically? Like if you say you have a new, and I know we're going to get in a little bit of this, but what expert judgment and real-world application? It's like what experts with how much experience are using these things in their
and also my
practice?
own expertise.
Sure, of course.
Like, and Tim, because like, if you were just like, if you fed every single study on running through Chat GPT and you said create a training program based on all of this, I think it would unlikely be that great because it doesn't account for the human element, and different studies can like sort of be outliers. Maybe there's different like levels of quality, and there's no way of appropriately synthesizing that information and correctly weighting different studies over others,
Right.
and then figuring out how does that apply to you individually, which is so important, and that is the job of the coach. So I think like when we talk about what it means to be evidence-based, what it means is we're not leaning on just like what one study says or what worked for me. Like as coaches, the worst thing you can do is like coach. You can share your perspective, but you should never update your practice based on an N of one. Even if you are the N of one and you truly believe in something, like experience is like only ever going to be like a little bit of seasoning in your coaching soup. So being evidence-based is a systematic way of thinking that weighs different types of evidence.
So why does being evidence-based matter? Well, helps to cut through
Yeah.
the misinformation that's out there.
Yep.
I mean, we've talked a lot about this on past episodes. You talk a lot about this in your podcast
I love
at YDS.
debunking things.
Yeah, and like in the health, fitness, nutrition space, in this world, pseudoscience runs like rampant.
Yep.
We have tons of influencers now in the space saying, do this, do that, take this supplement, take that one. And we need to have an evidence-based approach to understand, okay, what in here actually matters? What are the big percentages at play that people should be focusing on if they want to have lasting, sustainable results over time? And what like in here is just snake oil?
Yep. And essentially being evidence-based leads to more effective decision-making in training, nutrition, whatever arena you're applying it in. And it can also help protect against cognitive biases like confirmation bias, which is only seeking evidence that supports what we only believe. Like if you want to say that VO2 max is the only thing that matters, I'm sure you can find a study that says that. Or that running economy is the only thing that matters, I'm sure you can find a study that says that. That threshold training twice a day, every day for the rest of your life is the only thing that works.
Moving to
I'm
Norway.
sure that study, yes, I'm sure that study exists. But we need to be able to contextualize all of these things and, yeah, hold space for the fact that with human brains, we have tendencies that science doesn't always support. So I do want to talk about some things that people get wrong about what it means to be evidence-based, because it is thrown around a lot by, like, people who are not, in my opinion, contextualizing things as appropriately as possible. So here is what it does not mean to be evidence-based. Science says X, so it must be true. Science is a process. It's not a fixed set of facts that are immutable. Individual studies can be wrong, misleading, or taken out of context. Science is a process of inquiry that oftentimes, like when you read a study, there are often, like a good study will express the limitations, the caveats, and all of the questions that they came up with throughout that process. So to ever hold anything up as definitive is not correct, or to say that science says, like, I always try to, when I'm talking with my athletes, say things like the best available evidence says, or emerging research says when that's appropriate, and trying to indicate, like, again, it's not like science says this, because that's just not accurate.
Common misconception number 2, being evidence-based means only doing what studies say and ignoring personal experience.
Yep. So again, the best, most holistic approach is going to blend scientific evidence with real world experience and individual differences.
I think it's like super important to recognize in endurance sports that often, like, best practices, the things that coaches who have been in the space for 15, 20, 30 years, sometimes those practices that show a lot of results are way ahead of what's actually being verified in the research.
Correct.
And so sometimes there are moments where real world experience does really matter compared to those studies.
And where the science doesn't square with the reality.
Right.
Really, the only big example that comes to mind in this instance right now is that most studies about, like, electrolyte intake in endurance sports recommend between 250 and 500 milligrams of sodium. We know from our experience that that is, like, the low end.
Right.
And the majority of people actually exist outside of that very narrow constriction. And a fascinating downstream impact of that is the Western States 100, because they try to be evidence-based. They don't have salt caps at their aid stations because the evidence doesn't recommend that.
Right.
However, we know in practice, like, yeah, some people need a lot more sodium than that
people.
really narrow prescription. And again, particularly when we're talking about things like trail and ultra running, because the science is limited, we are heavily caveating studies that are already done. So we have to sort of update things in a, where the art meets the science type way. We have to bring in real world experience, and that will change how we do things. And also, we're talking about individuals here, so we have to update depending on each individual, because if there's a study about 6 40-year-old male Norwegian cyclists, what the fuck does that mean for a 30-year-old, like, postpartum runner?
Yeah, totally. Another misconception is if there's no study, it must not work. We kind of talked just a little bit about this, but just because something hasn't been studied yet doesn't mean it's ineffective. It just means we don't have strong data on it.
And it also doesn't mean definitely do it, right? Like,
right.
This is, I feel like, ketones exist in this area where, like, the way they're being used in practice really outpaces the best available data. There is some available data that suggests their use in, like, type test cases. And again, like, this is something that I feel like discussions, particularly around supplements, get really flattened. Like, creatine is evidence-based. How? Why? When? Like, what use? Like, if I want to run 100 miles, the evidence doesn't actually support creatine usage for, that. And so, like, understanding that, like, just because there might even be, like, very robust evidence for something to be used, always acknowledging the limitations of that evidence and how you translate that to practice.
Like sodium bicarb is another great example
Correct.
of that.
Tons of evidence backing up the use of sodium bicarb in specific circumstances.
Right.
And do those translate to longer distances? Well, when you understand what the mechanism that they're using is, like, not just me. This is, like, what a lot of people are saying. You're hearing it more and more, but, like, the majority of experts are taking the specific studies on sodium bicarb and saying, like, well, because this helps you buffer lactate, that's not usually the energy system that you're firing on when you're running 100 miles. Therefore, do you need to be drinking this or eating this fancy goo soup when you're running 100 miles? Probably not.
Right. So how do we evaluate scientific studies? What's the hierarchy of evidence that we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, so it's important to note that not all studies are created equal, and we want to weight different types of research depending on their reliability and what type of study it is. So my favorite, oh my gosh, I just get so excited whenever I see a meta-analysis or a systematic review. This is like, especially when I'm reporting, this is the good shit. So what a meta-analysis or a systematic review is a combination of multiple studies on a topic to look for overall trends. So for example, a meta-analysis on carbohydrate fueling in endurance sports looks at dozens of studies to see the bigger picture. We like this because it means the sample size is going to be bigger, and it minimizes bias from individual studies. So it gets a lot easier to find the signal in the noise when you are looking at a study that's of other studies.
Yeah, it's awesome when you have a good meta-analysis.
Yep.
We also have randomized controlled trials, RCTs.
RCTs?
So the gold standard for experimental research, participants are randomly assigned to different groups to test an intervention. An example of that might be one group follows a high carb diet, another follows a high fat diet, and researchers compare the performance across both of those groups. It's strong because the randomization reduces biases and there's clear cause and effect relationships, which is like, at least for me, I put like a double asterisk there because we know causation and it gets us away from that correlation factor, which we're going to talk about in a second.
So third best kind of study, starting to get into the yellow light realm here.
We're in yellow light here, in my opinion.
This is an observational study. So these are cohort studies, case control studies, surveys, and epidemiology. So that is looking at trends over time, but it doesn't have sufficient data to establish cause and effect. So like the saying of like umbrellas are strongly correlated with it raining. Well, do they cause rain? No. So like you can understand that like these things are not always like a 1-to-1, and when we're making decisions we need to weigh that accordingly. So another example would be studying a group of ultra runners and noticing that they tend to eat more carbohydrates, but that doesn't prove that carbs make them faster, just that there's a relationship. So it can still be like, oh, that's an interesting thing to know, maybe we should research that further, but this is really to the point where I'm like, I'm probably not going to be updating my practice here. So again, noting that correlation is not causation. Other factors might be at play that particular data set can't speak to.
Case studies and expert opinion. How do we feel about this?
So this is orange
the scientific
territory.
Community feel about it?
Orange. We feel orange about it.
So case studies look at one or a few individuals in depth. This athlete did X and it worked for them. This is kind of where we get into that N of 1 stuff. Expert opinions are useful, but are often biased. So we have to be really, really careful about this. Ankle weights work for me, so it must work for you. There's no control group. There's a very small sample size, often one person, lots of confounding factors.
Yep. So this is really where it's like, again, like this often will point to, we should look into this additionally.
Yes.
And can be something that like sort of helps us direct the spotlight of our attention, but should not be guiding and updating practice.
Testimonials.
And anecdotes.
Ooh.
So there's the saying the plural of anecdote is not data.
Right.
So anecdotes and testimonials are something that we really like want to proceed with maximum caution around. So this is sort of the like, it worked for me, so it must work for anyone. If you ever hear a coach say that, run, don't walk, because holy shit, not good. For example, someone might say like, I cut out gluten and got faster. Was it the gluten? Was it something else? We literally can't say. And I think that this is particularly onerous when it comes to like oh, look, like XYZ athlete does this much amount of volume, therefore I should do that. Or this athlete eats this specific product, I should eat it.
This many carbs an hour.
This many carbs an hour. Or does, has this, like, they're vegan, they're paleo, they don't eat it all while they're running. No. Bad sample size, not something that we should use to update our practice. So it's the weakest because N of 1, not good. That just doesn't prove anything scientifically. And, like, yeah, probably there are, like, there's always, humans are fucking crazy. So there's always going to be outliers. And particularly in the world of running and ultra running and trail running, it's, like, fucking all outliers out here. So I think that, like, always contextualizing. And I would say that for folks who are communicating around things, we should be additionally careful and nuanced to caveat our N of 1s. On YDS, we have like a trap horn that we play anytime we share an anecdote, because I want to draw attention to how often that happens and like have people be like, oh, okay, yes, this is an anecdote. This is not data. I need to experience it differently. Because particularly on podcasts and social media, when like it's so single source that like it's a sample size of 1 in many cases. So
totally,
I think that that's just really an important thing, and communicators do have responsibility here to say like, maybe like I did however many calories, how many grams an hour. That's just me. Here's what the best practices say, and here's why it could or could not work for you. So
what makes a study strong?
So here are the things, like these sort of boxes we want to check when we're evaluating, like, is this a good study? Should we pay attention to this? Should we put it on our podcast and share it? Should I make a social media post based on this? Do I need to dunk on it in an episode of YDS? So sample size is huge. So larger studies, which is ideally hundreds or thousands of participants, are more reliable than small studies, which is under 20 people. For instance, a study on 10 elite runners, how applicable is that to like my coaching roster? Not very.
Right.
And I think that one of the difficulties here is that in sports, in exercise physiology and in nutrition, it is very hard to find studies with big sample sizes. Like, it is really not that uncommon to see 6. No women, 6 dudes. So that's always a big thing that we're looking for. And it doesn't, like, there can be context where it might be worth looking at studies with small sample sizes, but always looking at the methodology and acknowledging the limitations of a limited sample.
We also have our control groups and randomization. So a strong study has a control group to compare against. So for example, one group takes a supplement, the other takes a placebo. If both groups improve, the supplement probably isn't doing anything special.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons where it's like very hard to study some exercise and nutrition interventions, because you know if you're fasting or not. You know if you are doing a near maximal effort or not. You know if you are foam rolling or not. So like, for instance, this is one of the reasons where we can't like definitively say or disprove that like different recovery modalities like the foam rolling or the massage impact recovery, because you can't have a placebo massage. You know if you're getting massaged or not, hopefully. Like, I guess if we knock people out.
Right.
I did read this crazy study that was like super buzzy a few years ago, where they were trying to assess the efficacy of like a knee surgery to sort of vacuum out like scar tissue and like damaged cartilage. And because they were so set on having a control group, there were study participants that were anesthetized, and the doctor did not know, the surgeon did not know if they were doing surgery or not till they literally got in the operating room. And if it was the control group, they sat in the operating room not performing, like the person was like opened up, they didn't vacuum anything, closed them back up.
Whoa. Incredible. Wow.
And what was super, so like I love that commitment here. And what was really crazy is that they actually ended up discovering that that particular type of knee surgery didn't improve outcomes over not vacuuming shit out of the knee. So love that. We love, like, this is like how we, like, this is where science gets really good, gets really juicy, but it is really tough in the context of like nutrition and exercise physiology, specifically with nutrition. Like, if you're trying to assess certain things, like, you can't starve people. Like, there are certain like ethical concerns of things you like can and can't do. So yeah, I think that that's always a big thing to look at.
Yeah. We have the blind and the placebo control. So in double-blind studies, neither participants nor researchers know who is receiving the intervention. So when testing a hydration strategy, if participants know they're drinking a fancy sports drink, the placebo effect can skew results. We also have the whether or not a study can be reproduced or not.
Yep.
So has the study been repeated by other researchers and shown the same results? This is actually really, really important because there's been a lot of what is quote unquote groundbreaking studies, especially in like psychology, where it's then those studies were they weren't ever able to reproduce those results. And so, when you have like the contradiction in the science, makes you take caution about what your, kind of like intervention you might recommend to somebody, or what, advice you might give them in a training context, or, wherever really.
Yeah. So for us science comms nerds, there's actually been something that it has been referred to in the media as like the crisis of irreproducibility in psychology, and particularly in sports psychology. A lot of things that often get shared as like common best practices are not reproduced time and time again in the research. So I think that's something that always, like, research is hard. It's not, in many cases, not definitive. And so having if something has been reproduced, sick. Love that. That's a really great thing that we're looking for. And if something can't be reproduced, depending on the context, that really puts us in proceed with caution and/or do not lean on territory, in my opinion.
Funding sources and conflicts of interest. This is also really, really important. Like, who paid for this study? Is it that protein powder company that you like? Is it so-and-so who has like a vested interest in a certain kind of finding from the research? We want to find studies that have a lot of transparency and that is not funded, by companies that have a conflict of interest in this process.
Yeah. So just because something is funded doesn't necessarily mean throw it out. But I think particularly in the realm of nutrition, like, this is something you often will see in terms of like, well, this creatine company has a study saying that creatine is awesome. Well, yeah, duh. So let's talk about some red flags when it comes to like, yeah, maybe this study really we don't need to overemphasize. So small sample sizes or no control group. For example, if the study is just on 6 cyclists and claiming a supplement improves performance, that's not going to be reliable.
Overblown claims in media headlines.
Looking at you, places I have worked in the past.
It's a really big red flag here. So studies often suggest trends, and media coverage can kind of exaggerate those findings. Coffee cures cancer. Red wine, is healthy.
Dark chocolate is healthy.
Yeah.
Red wine will kill you. Dark chocolate will kill you. This one is difficult because if you wrote an article and the title was "The relationship between human heart health and wine is extremely complicated, nuanced, caveated, and here are 2,000 words explaining that complicated relationship," no one's going to read that. So clickbait, not great, but also like media, do better. But also, like, if your attention is money, spend it on headlines that are good.
Conflicts of interest also just have to be disclosed. So
yeah.
Researchers should state if they have any financial ties to the product being tested, if it's if there's a product being tested.
Right. So this is something that, like, if during or after peer review that like people find out wasn't disclosed, that study is going to be yanked from the journal. And there's actually a database so that you can see journals that tend to have studies that end up being discredited or yanked disproportionately, and also authors of studies who have, or whose authors for whom their studies are frequently retracted. There's like literally a watch list run by a nonprofit group. So that's like on the really extreme end of things, people publishing in vanity journals just to like be an author, be published, because it is important for different processes in academia. Again, this is not common, but like this stuff is complicated, and thank God for watchdog organizations helping with that.
Talk to us about this lack of statistical significance.
P hacking. Let's talk about p hacking. So the p value, or the probability value, should be below 0.05 for meaningful results. For example, if the p is like 0.12, that's not a big deviation from statistical chance, and the results can kind of just be a fluke. It does not really mean a lot. That's something where it doesn't even have statistical relevance, so it certainly doesn't have clinical relevance, and definitely doesn't have practical applications. Another big one that we see, particularly in nutrition and other like sort of buzzy, groundbreaking studies, extrapolation from animal or cell studies to humans. Like, for instance, AG1, evidence-based. Their evidence is based on they made a petri dish that has like a reformatted like science soup version of a human microbiome. Oh. And they were able to show in this thing that is not a human and not a microbiome that AG1 increased the diversity of the whatever in it, which, like, I'm not a petri dish.
Right.
That study means nothing for me. It's also one petri dish.
Yeah, so, it's crazy how much their marketing
leans into science.
Right, and push that product out to, probably hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah. So, okay, we just talked about, is the study good? Is the study not good? How do we know when we actually need to update what we're doing on the ground today, where the rubber meets the road? Like, how often do we actually change our coaching practice? So here, I think it's really important to acknowledge that context matters. So science gives averages, but individuals vary, right? Like, there's going to be outliers on either side, and the populations that we work with are often different than the populations that are studied, right? Which are oftentimes like either elite athletes or college students that the researchers have access to.
Right.
For example, research shows that most runners benefit from 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour during a marathon, but others need 90 grams, and others will tolerate even less. That doesn't make that science not valid, but again, science is a process, not an answer. So just because a study says that X worked for a group doesn't mean it'll work for everyone, and doesn't mean a coach should update their practice tomorrow.
So when would we update that practice?
Yeah, so here's the framework that I kind of like to use when I'm assessing like how and when and why should I apply this research. So does this align with broader scientific consensus? If one groundbreaking study contradicts decades of research, we're going to be skeptical. So, for example, if a new study says carbs are bad for endurance athletes, that contradicts the majority of research, we're going to want to look closer. You should never update your practice based on one thing. Like, we're looking at averages of averages of averages, which is, again, I'm just a girl standing in front of anyone in exercise physiology asking for more meta-analyses, particularly ones that acknowledge the existence of people who aren't men. Please and thank you.
Does it make sense based on what we already know? So kind of goes along with this first point, but if a study suggests something completely new, take caution in considering whether or not that is something that you want to, bring into your toolbox of tools as a coach. Right. For example, like ice baths are going to make you faster. Like, okay, is there a mechanism in there that makes sense to you based on your coaching experience?
Or based on physiology, right? Because like same thing with sodium bicarbonate is the mechanism where it works, helping you buffer lactate makes fuck all sense for applying during an ultra marathon or things longer than an hour.
Right.
So always taking into context, wait, like what would actually explain this?
Can you test it in your own life in a low risk way?
Science is useful, but personal experimentation can have a place depending on the context. So if a study says, there can be times where this is useful to apply in practice. This is, again, the lowest on our totem pole. So, like, both of us have tried things like ketones.
Yeah.
Both of us have tried things like high carb fueling. I have not updated my practice based on either of those self experiments, other than encouraging people to experiment with their own fueling if they want to go high carb, because there's evidence showing you can, and there are benefits, but there's also a lot of evidence showing that individuals are going to individuate. So it's always important to take that into context.
Balancing science with experience. I think this is kind of like one of the arts of coaching where the rubber really meets the road. Evidence-based is not the same as evidence exclusive. So walk us through that a little bit.
So research is a starting point. It's super important, and I think it's like one of the best heuristics we have for making decisions around coaching, amongst many other far more important things. But real world application is key. For instance, if there was a study that showed that drinking a liter of sodium bicarbonate every hour helped you run faster during an ultramarathon, how are you going to carry that liter? There are real world, races aren't a laboratory. Life isn't a laboratory.
It's so true. Great, 120 carbs an hour reduces muscle damage. Great, we have a couple studies that shows that. Can you carry all of that fuel for a 12-hour race?
Tolerate it? Because the science does say it reduces muscle damage, but if you have experimented with that habitually and it does not work for you, then that doesn't mean you don't exist. You still exist in the context of that scientific study. Individuals are individuals. For example, if science says static stretching before a race doesn't help improve performance, but if it genuinely makes you feel better, there are some places where I'm knock yourself out. You want to do ketones, maybe give a quick Google about the long-term metabolic impacts of those, and then knock yourself out. You want to do sodium bicarb before your long run? I want to know what job you have that you can afford extraneous sodium bicarb. Knock yourself out. So I think it's always important. There are risk benefit of there are some things where I'm really fucking don't do that. Don't restrict your carbohydrates. There are some things that don't. And there's some things where I'm yeah, what the hell?
Yeah,
if you really want to do collagen, despite, the complexity of the evidence and the potential limited test cases for these things, go for it. There's minimal downsides besides financial, sort of stuff in terms of collagen. So, good coaches, athletes, and dietitians are always going to integrate both. You use science, you are firmly planted in the science, and you are also firmly planted in the experience and work with individuals. Why? So flexibility is also key. Again, science is a process. It is alive. It is growing. It is evolving. It is ongoing. And today's best practices may change with new evidence. Something I find really funny is that oftentimes when I am onboarding a new athlete and I'm talking about being evidence-based, they'll be like, are you always looking at the latest research? And I'm yes, but I'm not changing how I coach every 3 days when a new study comes out, because that would be insanity and also not evidence-based. So there are science works really slow, and we are seeing kind of an interesting pendulum swing that is pretty rare in our sport right now with the high carb stuff. But oftentimes that is not how things work. There aren't huge, big, sudden shifts most of the time on things. The stuff evolves pretty slowly. So best practices may change with new evidence, but you shouldn't be constantly chasing the latest, greatest, bright, shiny object, even if it is backed up by a study. So we used to think that, for example, another one here is that we used to think dehydration was directly caused by cramps. Now we know it's more about neuromuscular fatigue. We know that you shouldn't ice certain injuries. We know that not all inflammation is bad. We also don't know that much more about inflammation. So again, more research needed. But things like this update all the time. But our practice, it's sort of when you're thinking of science inching forward as being this big aggregate of information. And if we want to be sort of in the middle, that middle is moving pretty slowly.
So a couple takeaways you can think about here. Being evidence-based means thinking critically, not blindly following studies. Look for strong studies and avoid red flags. Apply research with context. Science is a tool and not a rule, and it is and it has to be balanced with experience. We like to use these reliable sources: PubMed, Cochrane Reviews, registered dietitians, credible science communicators.
Hi. Shout out to my work wife, Kylie.
Yeah, trusted practitioners. Very, very important.
Yeah. But we really did want to discuss this with you guys because we like to pull back the curtain and show how we're making these decisions. And I think I actually wish more coaches talked about this process and how they make these decisions, because it will vary. And I think that people weaponize terms like science-based and evidence-based to support what they just want to say anyway. And the stuff is messy and nuanced and complicated.
Unfortunately, they do it to support their own confirmation biases. And a great coach, a great practitioner in any space consistently looks at where their implicit and explicit biases lie in order to get to the heart of the tool that is applicable to the individual they're working with. And that's where the rubber meets the road. You can find a study to support whatever opinion you have on the best thing that you think is the new hack for whatever. But the question really remains is whether or not the sample size is large enough, those results are reproducible, and all of these other things come into play that if this actually works for the general population.
Yeah.
We've seen time and time again, especially in the trail running space. I don't spend as much
People
time.
are real bad at science in our sport. Jesus fucking Christ.
I don't spend a lot of time like in the marathon, like digging into what this is like in the marathon space, but I would imagine it's quite hacky too at the top of the sport.
Yeah.
Where, less than 1% for an elite is the difference between like winning a race or not. And so everyone's going to look for that next thing to give them an edge. But again, that N of 1, what works for 6 elites is not necessarily good for the general public. So, hey, if you guys have made it this far through this podcast, that was a lot of information.
Yeah, wow, you're our kind of person.
Yeah, we love you. We know that you care about this stuff as much as we do. We appreciate your questions. This was a listener question, so super appreciated that.
It was a YouTube comment, but yeah. So engage with us on the platform of your choice and leave us a positive review if it feels good to you.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Shameless self-promo, but I have a roster spot available. So if you've made it this far, we're probably a good coach-athlete match.
You're probably TJ's future wife.
Reach out. We'd love to hear from you guys. microcosmcoaching@gmail.com, microcosm-coaching.com. We're on Instagram, microcosm coaching. See you guys.